Hey all, and welcome back to There's Danger Here. I'm Leilani, and it's the first Monday of the month, so as usual, we're going to be talking about another MMIW episode. This time, I am going to be talking about a serial killer, and the reason he's highlighted is because he specifically targeted indigenous women. The man is John Martin Crawford. So let's get into him, shall we? John Martin Crawford was born on March 29th, 1962, in Steinbach, Manitoba, to an unmarried woman in Victoria. Though she did marry in 1964 to Al Crawford, and the family grew with the addition of a brother and sister. In 1967, the family moved to Vancouver. His stepfather was an alcoholic, and while I didn't see any reports of abuse, it did result in a divorce. John began running away at about 3, being brought back to the house by police often. While in the care of a babysitter, John got a hold of a lighter at age 4 and burned his upper chest, neck, and arm, needing to spend time at a hospital. Multiple sources also report that at age 4 and 7, he was molested while under the care of a babysitter. At age 5, his mother became addicted to bingo, and his father continued to regularly drink away their money. John was sent to see psychologists at Vancouver General Hospital due to behavioral problems and poor academic performance around this time. He had debilitating nightmares and was afraid of the dark. Still, by 12, he managed to transform into a bully, picking on those that were smaller than he was. In order to get by, he also began sniffing glue. As a teen, his running away continued, along with stealing cars and drinking alcohol. He began using other drugs such as LSD, mushrooms, Valium, Ritalin, and Talwin. At 13, he and 2 other boys paid an 11-year-old girl $5 to have sex with them. He then began visiting sex booths and watching sex shows. By 16, he began having auditory hallucinations that occurred relatively often, believing they were voices from UFOs or other planets. His first confirmed killing of someone occurred on December 23, 1981, in Lethbridge, Alberta. The 19-year-old met 35-year-old Mary Jane Sirloin. During autopsy, deep bite marks were found on both her breasts. After she was found, the local paper didn't even headline the murder. She was below a story about a club delivering poinsettias to a nursing home. About the lack of attention, Mary's sister stated, quote, "It seems any time a native is murdered, it isn't a major case. It's just another dead Indian." End quote. John was charged with first-degree murder. He ended up taking a plea deal for manslaughter, which resulted in just a 10-year sentence. He had difficulty coping with prison, feeling threatened, resulting in him self-mutilating. During his time incarcerated, he was transferred to Prince Albert, which is close to the Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon, including in April 1984, when he cut his wrists in an attempt to go into segregation. A year later, he went back to the center after being, quote, acutely disoriented, behaving idiotically, throwing sticks about, smearing toothpaste over himself, and laughing inappropriately, end quote. One of the psychiatrists at the center diagnosed him with hebephrenic schizophrenic illness. This includes periods of acute delusions and hallucinations. Even with this, 5 years in his sentence and he was paroled. He broke his parole in 1987 and returned to complete the rest of his sentence. In 1988, he met Dr. V. Singh, another psychiatrist. After a comprehensive medical workup, Dr. V reported that he could find no evidence of any psychiatric disorder. In 1989, another psychiatrist, Dr. W. A. Bostros, had concerns about John's ability to return to the community. reporting, quote, "This is very likely a case of schizophrenia with heavy load on the negative symptomology. This means that the condition started at a young age and led to a great degree of handicap for the individual. The recovery with medications tends to be limited, and the prognosis on a whole is moderate to poor." End quote. In addition to that, he stated, quote, "Since Crawford suffers from schizophrenia and has a history of delinquent behavior, there is a high probability that he will become involved in further crimes." End quote. John was released on March 23, 1989, in Saskatoon. At this time, he was 29 years old. He would troll for women in the evenings, paying for prostitute using his mother's 1970s green Chevy Nova. In December 1990, he was fined for trying to hire a prostitute that turned out to be an undercover cop. In 1991, Bill Corrigan, his former prison mate turned friend, was also released from prison. The pair reunited, often hanging out drinking at the Albany Hotel in Saskatoon. They even trolled the streets together in the Nova. While John had a reputation for being abusive to the women on the streets, newer girls were often left unaware. A few of the times they were trolling for women, they met with Shelley Napope, one of the One Arrow First Nations. Shelley was 16 and had a drug habit. It was in early 1992 when Shelley first met the men. Seeing them again during the summer, she didn't end up hesitating for a ride to Confederation Park. According to Bill, Shelley got in the front seat and Bill moved to the back. They stopped at a house that she wanted to, and John was impatient in the car. Poop. He had injected Ritalin earlier that evening and was high. When she returned, they began drinking beer that was already in the car. Instead of driving to Confederation Park, John took them 20 minutes out of town down a dirt road. The road led to a place called Bare Ass Beach, but John stopped before the turnoff and into a field down a grove of trees. He turned off the car and gave the keys to Bill to get more beer from the trunk. After Shelley drank the beer, John told Bill to take a walk. So Bill left. Bill reported that shortly after stepping away, he heard John scream at Shelley, quote, "You bitch, you know you liked it. Don't look so pissed off." End quote. John slapped her, and when Shelley attempted to flee, he began punching her. John got out of the car, then pulled out the still nude Shelley, continuing his assault as he moved to the bushes. Bill got in the car, but when Shelley quit yelling, Bill reports that he got out and went over to the bushes. There, he saw John standing over Shelley with a knife in her abdomen, which turned out to be Bill's knife that he had loaned to John earlier that night. Shelley had multiple stab wounds to the chest and stomach area. When Bill came over, John told him to get branches to conceal her body. John took the knife back as they worked. Then the men simply returned to Saskatoon. As soon as they got into town, John threw Shelley's clothes into a dumpster. Then John drove home and took his own clothes off and showered. At the end of the night, he drove Bill home. In 1992, John was charged with the rape of Janet Sylvester, a 36-year-old indigenous woman. The charges, though, were eventually dropped as Janet failed to show at trial, but he spent months in jail before his mother bailed him out. On September 20th, 1992, John went out prowling for women again. This time, he found Eva Taysup. After completing his sex act, he strangled her. Then he drove her body over to the area that he had left Shelley, wrapped her in a cloth, and buried her in a shallow grave. At some point, he cut off the lower part of one of her arms, but there is never an explanation as to why he did this. The very next day, on September 21st, 1992, John is out prowling the streets again. This time, he finds Calinda Waterhen. Again, they complete a sex act and John strangles her as well. John takes her to the same location as Shelley and Eva and dumps her as well. But in the way that he didn't bother to bury Shelley, he leaves Eva out in the elements. On October 2nd, 1992, John is charged with attempted murder of Derek Langer for the refusal of a cigarette. As a result, John is in the Saskatoon Correctional Center for the bulk of 1993. In July of 1993, police informant Bill Corrigan called Stan Liptick, his RCMP handler, in order to give them a name for crimes that he knew about women. A one John Potter. Stan was on vacation and spoke instead with Constable Malcolm Eskelson, where Bill gave this vague report as the two drove around the area he claimed to be the site of a dump. Then mentioned going to Bear Ass Beach with a 16-year-old that he believed to be named Angie. Unable to remember if she returned back to Saskatoon with them, Bill seemed to be hazy on many of the details at the time. Constable Malcolm looked for an Angie or a John Potter, but came up empty at the time. After returning from vacation, Constable Malcolm relayed his encounter with Bill to Stan, and Stan wrote a report about the incident and again spoke with Bill, who rambled often. The site he originally said would have a body came up with nothing, even through the use of search dogs. Stan continued to work with Bill, however, and continued going out to the site Bill claimed contained at least one body on and off for months. Then, on October 1st, 1994, Brian Reichart decided to go hunting with friends in a bush near the South Saskatoon River. The men were out for 2 hours when Brian found a human skull, and Shelley was finally found. At first, Brian thought it was part of a ceremony from years past, but after a short amount of time, he called it in to the police. Constable Terry Sterling went out with Brian to the site of Shelley's murder. He immediately began photographing the scene and searched the area. Then, the constable contacted Dr. Ernie Walker, a professor of anthropology at the University of Saskatchewan. While Dr. Walker worked for the university, he consulted for the police department. Dr. Walker made it to the site on October 4th, confirming immediately that it wasn't an anthropological site, as Shelley's body still had some soft tissue and mats of hair that hadn't decomposed completely. The limited physical evidence that was left behind was collected, and Shelley was transported to the morgue at the Royal University Hospital. In order to ensure that Shelley was as complete as possible, Dr. Walker crawled on his hands and knees to find the bones, managing to collect over 90% of her skeleton. There was no attempt to cover her, and as such, elements and scavengers got to the remains. This is what left little evidence behind. The site where Shelley was found was 10 to 15 meters away from where Stan had been going for months. Then, on October 13th, an older man was walking along the gravel road 15 kilometers west of Saskatoon when he spotted something in a clump of trees. When he was close, he realized it was a woman. 37-year-old Janet Sylvester was found with a bag over her head, nude. Back at the original site on October 21st, Corporal Robert Todd and Staff Sergeant Bob Stair were walking near the site of Shelley's body when Corporal Todd noticed something 30 to 40 meters west. He found another human skull. 85% of this woman's skeleton was recovered. She too had not been covered and was also skeletonized, leaving behind little evidence. Realizing that this could be a dump site, other officers were brought in, and when they arrived, searched the area. One of the assisting officers, Constable John Hudak, found a third body. In this case, however, she was buried in a shallow grave, though her skull and a portion of her arm were above ground. Her left arm was sawed off at the elbow and removed after death. Still, with this, they had more evidence, collecting everything they could and taking it all back to the morgue. Her jaw showed signs of a break around the time of death, as well as at least one rib. After all these women were found, Stan's report was identified, and the need to talk with Bill again was absolute. Turns out, however, Bill had fled Saskatoon in February of 1994 after stealing about $1,680 from the Albany Hotel. He was easily found in Winnipeg as he was collecting welfare and working part-time as a school crossing guard. Stan was sent to retrieve Bill alongside Constable Al Keller. They went to his apartment, and Bill agreed to meet later that day in the Westin Hotel. Bill was questioned for hours. Finally, they talked about the possibility of being charged with accessory after the fact, and it was then that Bill admitted he made up the name John Potter. He also admitted some truths, including the name of the man he was actually with at the time, a one John Martin Crawford. The next day, Bill was taken to D Division headquarters in Winnipeg, where one of his two statements was videotaped. He also admitted to being afraid of John Crawford at the time, which is why he had never come forward. On October 11th, a surveillance team began watching John. That same night, he was seen picking up a young woman, whom he assaulted and dumped in a storage lot. She was beaten, her eyes and nose were swollen, and there was evidence of sexual assault. Officer Todd followed behind and picked her up. He asked if anything happened, and she denied. So she was arrested and subsequently released the next morning without giving any statement. John was seen going home at around 9 o'clock at night. Their surveillance team decided to have an impromptu meeting and then called off the surveillance for the night. John's home was a mere 2 blocks from his favorite area to troll for hookers. Janet Sylvester was still out looking for a John of her own that night, moving between bars. Last seen leaving with a large man around midnight. She was found the next day, though she has never been officially linked to John Crawford, and her case does remain unsolved. In the meantime, Bill is brought to Saskatoon and videoed at the scene of the crime as he recounted what happened, earning himself $300 for his trouble. And then a deal is struck where he would testify and both receive immunity and a total of $15,000, the first half of which would be paid in pretrial, and the second after his testimony at trial to come in the future. With a deal made, the RCMP still had work to do to link John Crawford to any of his crimes. In late 1994, an anonymous woman who was working as a sex worker came in to tell police that in the spring of 1992, she was taken by Bill Corrigan and John Crawford to a remote place in the woods and choked after her services were complete. Nothing came of this. Now, up to this point, these women were unidentified. In November, the RCMP reached out to other agencies to help look for missing women that met the criteria. They found almost 500 names spanning 3 years, about half of which were eliminated quickly. They focused on local women, in addition to releasing 2 composite sketches. In the meantime, the final victim was identified as Eva Taysup by her mother. On December 14, 1994, Shelley Napope was identified when a friend came forward with information about her, and dental records confirmed. Her family had reported her missing in 1992. After tailing John and getting nowhere, the police had an idea. Once again, they were going to need to call on John's old friend, Bill. They brought Bill back to Saskatoon on January 9, 1995, placing him in a safe room. Bill was taught how to use equipment that was going to be needed in the near future. 4 days later, Bill was placed in a hotel room that had microphones throughout, and Bill himself was mic'd up. Around the corner of the motel, Constable Tom Steenvoorden was monitoring the equipment. Bill called John, and that evening the pair met up. Over the next few days, John admitted to 3 of the murders. He explained where he did it, how he did it, and that he brought them to the same location because that area was considered safe. John even admitted to burying one of the women in a shallow grave, things that were never reported in the media. 5 days later, John was arrested for the murders of Shelley Napope, Eva Taysup, and Calinda Waterhen. His trial began on May 21st, 1996, and lasted 10 days, overseen by Justice David Wright. During the trial, it was decided that victims of his attacks that were still alive would not be allowed to testify to show his character. Still, there were John's own admissions and the reports from Bill, along with expert testimony to corroborate John's admissions. John refused to testify in his defense. After the trial finished, the jury deliberated for almost 10 hours when a verdict came back. In the end, he was found guilty of first-degree murder of Shelley Napope and second-degree murder for Eva Taysup and Calinda Waterhen. Sentencing occurred the next day, and in Canada, first-degree murder is an automatic life sentence. But with the advent of the, quote, faint hope cause, end quote, a person can apply for parole after just 15 years. Therefore, the judge decided that he should receive life plus 15 years for each second-degree murder charge to be run consecutively. Before it would begin, Justice Wright had something to say. Quote, I begin by observing that in the latter stages of this trial, the victims seem to have been largely forgotten. I don't suggest that was due to the callousness on the part of anyone, but in my observation, that's what happened. End quote. Judge Wright also stated, quote, these were 3 young women of Native ancestry who happened to be prostitutes. They had families, friends, and lives, although perhaps not very good lives, but they made decisions for themselves. They lived as they wished, although in many cases, I suspect, as necessity dictated, but they were lives. What was there about these 4 victims that made Mr. Crawford feel that he could take their lives after sexually assaulting them, confining them, terrorizing them, and then brutally killing them? And finally, what on earth can explain his actions in mutilating 2 of them? I refer in his conviction with respect to Miss Sirloin. She was left naked, the final indignity, on her back and exposed and mutilated by biting. Miss Taysup's arm was cut off at the elbow. For what possible reason? It appears to me that Mr. Crawford was attracted to his victims for 4 reasons. 1, they were young. 2nd, they were women. 3rd, they were native. And 4th, they were prostitutes. They were separated from the community and their families. The accused treated them with contempt, brutality. He terrorized them. He violated them sexually. He confined them, and he ultimately killed them. He seemed determined to destroy every vestige of their humanity. He left 3 of them naked and lying on the ground. There is a ferocity in these actions that reminds me of a wild animal, a predator. The accused has shown no remorse, absolutely none, no regrets. There's been no effort to explain his actions, and in fact, we know from the tapes that he laughed about the killings. End quote. In the end, he finished by saying these were the most horrifying murders he had come across in his 16 years as justice, and that he would extend his ineligibility for John's parole as long as he was allowed by law, which was set at 25 years, that his recommendations and comments were reported to the and placed in his court file. With that, appeals began, and after years of fighting, all appeals were finally denied in 1999. On December 16th, 2020, John died. The Correctional Service of Canada said that he was an inmate at the Regional Psychiatric Center at the time of his death. Now, let's get into some of the women, okay? Shelley Napope was born on July 31st, 1976, the daughter of Hubert and Merle Napope, and one of 3 children in the family. One summer, the family left for a month, returning to their home on the reserve to find that it had been ransacked and utterly destroyed, to the point where they were told to simply demolish the house. But the chief reported that they would rebuild it the next year. Still, time after time, it was not rebuilt, and so the family decided to move to Saskatoon, where they could find housing. Shelley was enrolled into a school in the area in January of 1984, but in her teen years she began skipping school, and her behavior became erratic. Later, her parents reported that they were drinking heavily at the time and blamed themselves for some of this behavior. Shelley was moved to a residential school, and while she was doing well in various subjects, she continued to have behavioral issues. She ran away often and got into drugs. By 14, she had become a ward of social services. She was placed in foster homes from which she frequently ran away. Her parents last saw her on July of 1992, when the then 15-year-old was walking with a friend. She was high, but initially was going to go with her parents as they were leaving for a trip to Alberta. Her friend reminded her that their boyfriends were waiting, and so young Shelley got back out of the van. After months of not hearing anything from her, Shelley's parents reported her missing with the Saskatoon police. Her parents bought her Christmas presents in 1992, and when she was finally released to the family in 1994, she was buried with the still unopened presents. Calinda Waterhen was born to Steve and Margaret in 1970, the first of 3 children in the home. At the time, Steve admits to being an alcoholic and abusive. The children ended up in foster homes as a result. On December 27th, 1983, after a bender, Steve decided enough was enough and quit drinking. While Steve was in his children's lives, they stayed with the guardians until they were grown. Calinda gave birth to a daughter on October 11, 1991, while she herself was in Pine Grove Correctional Facility for Women. Calinda was released a month later and stayed with her father and stepmother with her own daughter for a time. But less than a week later, Calinda left for Saskatoon, leaving her child in the care of her family. That was the last time she was seen by any of her family. In late 1992 and early 1993, 2 family funerals were held in which Calinda was not in attendance. This sparked fear in Steve, and he went to the local RCMP to report her missing, but was assured that she was fine in Saskatchewan. Quote, "The officer told me that her health card was being used, but since she was over 18, they couldn't tell me her location, even though I was her father." End quote. After the October 1994 discovery of women, Steve went back to the RCMP, who continued to state that Calinda was alive. It seems someone in Saskatchewan was using her card. But on January 13, 1995, Corporal Jerry Wild issued a news release confirming Calinda's identity as the 3rd victim. An RCMP officer came to deliver the news. She was only 16 when she was killed. Eva Taysup was one of 11 children to Mary Taysup and Oliver Hawassen. She grew up on the Yellow Quill Reserve in eastern Saskatchewan. When Eva was 17, she began to rebel against her sheltered parents and the life they provided. Even after the family moved to Kelvington, Eva ran away, eventually moving in with a cousin in Saskatoon. This is where she met Ian Gardypie, and they moved in together. In 1985, Eva gave birth to a little girl, followed by 3 more children in short succession by 1989. By 1991, Eva and Ian were separated. 2 of their children went to live with their grandparents, and the other 2 and the other 2 stayed with her Aunt Corinne. Eva began to party after this. She and Sister Bev spent New Year's Eve of 1991 at the Barry Hotel, Eva's favorite location. In mid-January 1992, Eva called her parents asking to come home. Her parents raised funds, but it took 2 weeks to do so, and when they arrived in Saskatoon, Eva was missing. The family went to the police in Saskatoon, Kelvington, and Yorkton, but nothing came of it. In November 1994, the RCMP made positive identification through dental records that she was the second person found. She was 22 when she was killed. Now, I know that's a different way than I normally talk about an episode, but again, I really wanted to highlight the women on this portion. So yes, I spoke about the serial killer, but I wanted to end with the women to remind everybody that this is an epidemic, that there is a huge population of missing and murdered Indigenous women. But they are still women. They are mothers, sisters, and daughters. They are friends, and they deserve to be remembered. And so with that, to all those out there listening, be careful. It's a dangerous world we live in.